Hello. I'm coming back again. And actually, I liked very much yesterday to having this discussion about domestication and when dogs might have evolved and all the stories about this when and where. But being an ethologist, I really like much better to talk about behavior and also these aspects of dog-human interaction and the whole problem of how we can learn about dog behavior and how this is connected possibly in some sense to human behavior. So just the strategy that I will use today is just very much the same as I tried to do yesterday. So basically, I will start with saying you or telling you the final outcome of this talk, if you like, the take-home message of what I want to share with you. And really, hopefully, in the following hour, I will be able to go through together with you on these topics. So the first is an idea that we are long developing, how to conceptualize dog behavior in general. And there are so many ideas out there, ideas that are originating from classical traditional ethology or study of animal behavior by European zoologists who were interested in this in a, let's say, biological way. And there's lots of things that are originating from the psychological approach, mainly of human behavior. So somehow along this line, I can actually understand why it's so difficult to conceptualize dog behavior, because this strange way they interact with their own species at the same time with humans. So we were working now a little bit on this line, and we came to this idea that maybe we could use this concept of what I call, or we call now, social competence, which is actually not a new concept. It's just have not been applied to animals in that way, or at least not so many times to animals, but it's well known by psychologists actually. And so the idea is that I'd introduce you to this idea, and hopefully you can also rely on that. And then in the later part of the talk, actually I would like to show two examples that grow out. I mean, the research around these two examples grew out from this concept, and I show you through these examples how you can come from understanding this importance of social competence in order to make specific hypotheses and then test them in a more controlled way. And these two concepts, one is about attachment, which we really think is a central feature that plays a role in this relationship between dog and human. And the second concept is what I call, and for short, imitation, which I know scientists are debating about a lot, what is imitation and what is not imitation. But just for the sort of making this discussion yet focused, I talk about it, or we refer to it as imitation. And I also try to argue that imitation in dogs is not just interesting from a theoretical perspective, so whether it's imitation or not and what sort of mental mechanisms there are working, but actually from a practical point of view. And I know there are so many dog trainers now here listening to this scientific conference, and you hear many things that are maybe a little bit distantly related to your everyday work. But I really would like to argue that actually our studies regarding to imitations dogs have really practical applications, and I also want to show a little bit of this, if I can, towards the end of the talk. So these are the three main issues I would like to discuss you in the next few minutes. So starting with this idea of social competence, in human literature, usually you have a social development that leads to some sort of social competence. And we're using this word, I mean, people are mainly using this word actually in education, where they learn that another individual, a child, or even an adult, is behaving socially competent way. So, however, if you're a biologist, you don't start usually at this level of development and social experience, but also at the level of genetics that also runs in parallel and is probably also in a way more fundamental than the aspects that are depending more on the environment. So we were thinking about introducing this concept of social competence at the level of genetic background. So basically that there might be some genetic background that makes an animal gives the animal the potential to behave in a social competent way, more or less. And I think this is also important, that when I'm talking about social competence, it's of course not only that sort of cooperative behaviors that people might think about, or what Mark was earlier underlining about fairness and working together and being always good and so on. So there are all sorts of aspects in order to get you through the specific society or specific group that you are actually living in. So social competence is a general concept of all those behaviors, and in this case about those genetically framed behaviors that make one animal able to live in that social group and provide him with some sort of skills to get through his life. So, and this concept might be actually quite useful if you have this dog-human interaction, because what we want to suggest is that, of course, that genetic background has to change in more or less or more bigger or smaller way in order to allow dogs to live with humans. So the idea here, what we want to suggest is that this anthropogenic human environment was an important factor in selecting for that sort of social competence that we have in dogs. And actually, what I put probably more correctly, the potential to develop a social competence in dogs. And of course, these challenges varied over these 15,000 or 10,000 or just 8,000 years. It doesn't matter if you think about back to the discussion we had yesterday. So basically, we think that and that was also the question was also raised yesterday many times, that this concept might help you provide a framework how to get from the wolf, which of course has its own social competence, which has evolved to survive in a wolf-like environment, to that social competence that our dogs have in order to survive in the human social environment. So just as a parallel, what we defined as an evolutionary social competence, of course, you can also have the other half of the story, which is the developmental social competence. So based on this genetic potential, now you have an animal that is living in a specific environment and obviously tries to make, again, the best out of it. So basically, by learning, experiencing, will develop a final social competence, which actually is based on the genetic one. And the claim is here a little bit that there are some constraints. So if you are living or you inherited a set of genetic background, that will allow you only to go a certain show a certain plasticity. And that's what I think is important to see. So basically, of course, dogs have that, or we assume at least, dogs have that sort of genetic potential that helps them to survive in a human-like environment as well. And yesterday we came to this idea, what would happen to dogs if there would be no humans anymore on Earth? So, and I think this is an interesting question to see from this aspect as well, because now if they don't have a social world where they can play out their social competence, they might be indeed having a problem. So I think you have to see these both aspects of social competence, and we see that, of course, if you have this evolutionary story with the humans, that also gives you some ideas how you get from that very general notion into more precise direction of making some research. So the idea where you can start is a very general one. I sort of inherited this from my former professor, Vilmos Csányi, who became very much interested in human social behavior. And he had this idea about looking at human social behavior and looking at the specific aspects of human social behavior that many people would call making us human. So in what way are humans specific as a primate? Let's put it this way. And he, many years ago, I mean, you can see it's now more than 10 years ago, he made that sort of lists, basically, in making arguments that, I mean, actually the list is much longer what he made, but making arguments in what way for example, attachment in humans is different from attachment that you might see in a chimpanzee or other apes and so forth. And actually, if you talk to anthropologists or comparative psychologists or anybody working on the primates, they might agree or disagree, but they probably you could see in which way many of these abilities are specific. Some are even human-specific in a way that we don't see them in those animals. Now, actually, at that time, he was thinking about three main factors that are sort of important in human social life. One is sociality, and one is synchronization, and the third is construction. And he assigned all of these features to one of these factors, let's put it this way. However, I think that it's actually very difficult to see that attachment is only related to, let's say, social behavior in general, because actually being attached also means a lot of synchronization in behavior. Or if you talk about, let's say, language, it's not just actually about construction something. I mean, that's not a object, but something, a mental representation. But actually, it also has lots to do with social behavior and also synchronization. So actually, I was suggesting that instead of having these simple lists, according to these three factors, you can actually having a three-dimensional space with each factor affecting in some combinations these functional traits. Now, you can imagine that the dogs somehow arriving in that complex social space where human social behaviors have these multiple functions. And the question, of course, is now how the dog's social competence, and of course, I forgot to say that this is what I would regard as a human social competence, so how the dog's social competence fits into that already existing and probably quite complex environment. And of course, the question is whether, first of all, do you need a total matching? Do you need all components emerging on the part of the dog or not? Or if they are similar components, whether they are working in a similar way, whether they have the same function, and whether the mechanism behind that is also similar. So, I mean, on this basis, you have to have different questions. I mean, one is this, what I call the functional approach. So the functional approach is basically looking whether the dogs have behaviors that might function in a similar way than they are function in humans. This could be shown usually in very relatively simple experiments. And then in the next level, if you like, then what is important is whether the mechanisms behind this function, that's why I'm saying is secondary. So we are not interested at the beginning about the mechanisms. We are interested at the function first. And then if we have already identify the function, then we can move, if you like, a level lower and look at the mechanism, how this behavior is organized in humans, and for us now it's interesting in dogs, which actually might be quite different. So that's important to keep in mind, that when we say that the dog is imitating, the dog is forming attachment, the dog is doing this and that, and this word will be used also by psychologists for humans, it does not mean, and we never think, that imitation in dogs is based on exactly the same mental or whatever mechanisms than in humans, for several reasons which we probably don't have the time to go into today. So basically, however, the first level is always making the prediction about the function. Then, of course, we can do these predictions based on observation and, of course, also on function that we know from human behavior. And then if you identify the function, then you can go into details, both in humans and in dogs. And actually, tomorrow I hope I can show you that this investigation, so this strategy, makes sometimes even new evidence or new insights about human behavior. So looking at this, making these critical investigations about mechanisms may also inform human psychologists about their understanding of mechanism in human behavior. So two examples today, without really going into the mechanistic details, will be shown in attachment and imitation. So about attachment. Well, I mean, this is, I think, the fourth time you see this picture. Again, I don't want to take sides about whether this little a collection of bones. I don't know how to call it now. It's really a dog puppy or a wolf puppy. I reread twice yesterday evening the paper, so I'm still not sure. Actually, at one time they say that this is a significant difference, which suggests that this is a dog, so I don't know. But anyway, I think what I want to draw to you is really this paper by Darcy Murray in Archaeological Science, and he wrote a book which you can actually also buy outside, which he makes the case for this idea of the situation that people were buried together, and he assumes, or at least he's on the side that that might be a dog, and actually he makes the case that in many other places where you find, let's say, dog bones together with humans is actually a burial site. And that's, I think, I mean, in his view, for them, very important because it shows this emotional bond with animals. And of course, again, I'm not an archaeologist, but as far as I know, no other, and as far as I know from him actually, no other burials were found during this time with other sorts of animals. So if it would be just sort of a biophilia on the side of the people, why they would not bury people with other types of animals? I mean, cats, rats, or rabbits, whatever. So, but I mean, that might not still be true. So I'm using this slide only to suggest that this emotional contact between dogs and humans, or that sort of canids, might be actually quite old. When we started to do our research, so it was in the 90s, last century, so it was a long time ago, then really at that time, there were studies looking at this human-dog attachment, but from a human point of view. So people were going out asking people about, whether you are attached to your dog or not, or whether you find your relationship to the dog as ideal, or what would be the ideal attachment that you feel, and so on. So there were many studies, if you can see from the dates actually, looking at this bond, but it was always the human who was actually targeted. And there were no experimental studies. So it was really interesting for us to have this revelation when we invited to Budapest a very famous German child psychologist, Karin Grossmann, and she was talking about child attachment behavior and showing tests and so on. And we were sitting, I remember, we were sitting among psychology students. We were just invited as ethologists, who might be interested in a topic on human behavior. And she was showing the video. I wish you will see the video shortly, similar videos, and where you can see a mother interacting with a child. And all of them, I mean, all of us sort of came to the same idea, just looking, you don't need to look very long, I mean, for a few seconds. Well, that's what you see when you were seeing interacting a dog and an owner in a setting, in a general setting. So basically, this similarity on the level of the behavior probably was on the level of the function, was so striking that it was so surprising to us that all these attachment studies on children have been done in the 70s, and nobody came to this idea to just repeat them on dogs. Which was actually more surprising was that after we published these studies in the end of the 90s, nobody seemed to be interested in the dog world about these studies for the next 10 years. But now you have lots of studies looking at dog-human attachment. So it takes, of course, some time for ideas to get through. I understand that, so I'm quite patient in other respect too, don't worry. But anyway, I think this whole idea of attachment, which goes back to Bowlby and many others actually in the United States, it's really important and really critical. And I think really this is a very critical aspect from, if you like, a central aspect for dog-human relationship. So this is, I hope in the meantime you could read the citation from his work. So basically, if you look at attachment, how you define it, and I took now a definition from Wolfgang Wickler, an ethologist, and another German ethologist. I combined them a little bit. Basically, you see that attachment is a tendency to contact and to maintain contact and closeness with a specific attachment figure who cannot be replaced by another of the same social category. So basically, this is a relationship, a very specific relationship that has between two individuals, and the word individual is very important here. So it's not just like mothers and children. I mean, as a social category or as a category of being of a specific breeding condition, but actually between two individuals. And that's important. And and here actually ethology and psychology, so child psychology, very early on shared very similar views, thanks to Bowlby and many others of this time. So, and here this is the 4 words you have seen from Mark showing that if you are, however, an ethologist, you are combining, of course, this view about function and evolution, so actually what are the advantages to having that sort of behavior, and also, of course, the mechanisms, including development and so on. So we, of course, don't go too much in this direction, just having a looking at the time, how fast it goes. So basically, you can argue, or you have to argue, what are the advantages of having or living in an attachment relationship. And people come up with different hypotheses. So, for example, protecting against danger. You can actually learn a lot about your attachment figures, so the parent in this case. When you are close to the parent, it also allows from learning, not just by finding out something, but actually also more directly. You can also learn how to collaborate, cooperate with your parent and so forth. And all of that actually does not only help you to get through to your early life, but actually it will change the adult life and also can have an effect. And in human psychology, there's a long argument how early experience, let's put it this way, of attachment influences later behavior and later social relationship with others in adult times. So for humans, it was quite clear, and even in some cases for animals, but for some strange reasons, actually, that view was missing from the dog literature. So another issue, which I just want not to go into detail, we can talk about this, is that people sometimes mix actually the idea of attachment and dependence. And they are often used as a synonym, especially, for example, in dog literature, if you find at all these concepts, where attachment is very much a specific social relationship. And that is really a social relationship you can clearly see from the Harlow studies. If you just go to YouTube and put in Harlow experiments, you get hundreds of videos, short video clips showing, the dramatic effect of this experiment, that despite that this monkey model is actually feeding the young monkey, it will prefer the model which has actually the fur and provides some sort of warm and nice tactile stimulation. So this is what we say, that basically the attachment is a social process. You don't really need any sort of extrinsic reward in the classical way, food or anything else, in order to develop a relationship. Now, of course, by other extrinsic rewards, you can make the other animal dependent, if you like, and that happens actually quite a lot in dog training, in a sense, when you're applying food and you restrict other types of food income of this part of the dog. That what you're actually doing is you're increasing the dependence. You don't increase attachment. But of course, at the level of the behavior, what you will see is quite similar things, that the dog will focus on you just in attachment. But you have to be aware that these are two partly different processes. In a normal, natural situation, I mean in animals living in the wild, depending on the parent, it doesn't go on forever, because each animal actually is sort of designed in a way that it should be able to live on its own and have their own offspring. And even the parents are designed in a way that they want to get rid of their offspring. Now, in the case of the dogs, that's not usually what happens, because we as attachment figures, or at least sort of a non-biological parents, we don't want to get rid of our dogs. Actually, that's a big difference. If people are sort of my age, you can see the difference. If you have a dog at home, you don't want to get rid of the dog. If you have a child at home, which becomes about 18, 20, actually you want to get rid of it. which is quite strange, no? I mean, it's the same species, actually, it's your blood, but that's very normal because that's how the biology is working. Just with dogs, you have a different type of biology. So anyway, that's just to showing that here are very complicated processes, and you have to be very clear which way you are going and what you want to study. Okay, so for attachment, it's a very long time, for a very long time, actually, people have a very nice behavior definition. So what we define as an attachment, or here you have a normal list of these behavior. So of course, what we already sort of what I indicated is this preference for the attachment figure. Then, of course, behaviors that are shown are usually called as separation behaviors. What is shown when you don't find the attachment figure. You want to be always close, but if it's not there, that you want to reduce this, or you want to get close to this. So you will show some separation behavior. Then specific behavior, which is usually called in a short way greeting behavior. So when you have the chance to meet your attachment figure again, then you will show some such specific behavior during this reunion. And to other effects, which are in a human psychology separated, actually in a functional level, they are quite similar. One, what is called a secure base. So basically, in your environment, you know usually, or you have some sort of awareness where your attachment figure is. And if there is this possibility to be close or somewhere near, then you just be sort of a relaxed way of exploring, getting around, and doing what your normal life is. But if in the case of danger, for example, what you can do is also to make several choices. One good choice actually is to go and approach, or actually if it's a big danger, run to your attachment figure to be saved and having a better chance to survive. So basically in both cases, the offspring in this case is actually taking in account where the attachment figure is, and and makes contact regularly, whether on a spontaneous basis or specifically when there is a danger. So all tests that you want to use for testing for attachment actually should be based on these behavior criteria. So I think I skipped that because it's basically the same idea made in a more nicer framework. So actually, what we did after Karin Grossman went home to Germany, we went to our laboratory and we just took her method. Actually, the method was originally invented by Mary Ainsworth. Yes, there she is. So Mary Ainsworth, and together with my colleague Josep Topal, we started just the same experiment. We didn't have to change anything. The only thing what we had to change was this time of these episodes, because in a human literature you have 3 minutes. I mean, there's an episode where the child is separated from the mother for 3 minutes. Now, you know, one thing what you probably know that dog owners are a little bit worse than mothers who have a child. That means that maybe a mother can survive a 3-minute separation, but a dog owner cannot. So we had to reduce this 3 minutes to 2 minutes. Actually, 2 minutes is also too long. I mean, you can do the same experiment with the 1 minute, and it's both good for the dog owner, for the dog, and for the researchers, because you don't have to so much to analyze. So this is actually a little story, if you like, a very simple story, that when you can investigate all these aspects of the behavior that I already told you. So actually it's much better, I can skip this and just to jump to the next slide, where this video will show you I don't know how. Oh, yes, okay. So this video, we won't go through this video, just to give you this impression how this is done in children. And basically the idea is here that the child and the mother are visiting the department where there is a room. They haven't been to the room, so the room is new or an unfamiliar place for the mother and the child. And what you look at it is a happy child that actually is playing with the mother and new objects and so on and so forth. So, and then if we just Yes, thank you very much. It's a good idea actually to play all the others, because then you can see and you will see that basically the same setup can also be used with the dogs. So we have now, of course, this is not a mother, that was the dog owner. We have now already these videos are playing a little bit faster, but you have the stranger coming in and interacting with the dog. And you will just see this happens because, you know, the episodes are a little bit longer in the human literature. The people, you will see that the stranger is entering and trying to interact with the child and so on and so forth. So I think and really because of the time, I will have to a little bit, can I play maybe this one as well? Yes, so we can just jump from here or try to do that, and what we will do is to go through this video very rapidly to give you this impression about how this test is done. So basically we have the dog owner together with the dog in the first episode, and they try to relax in the room, especially the dog owner. He might be a little bit excited. This is now a demo, so it's not a real experiment. I show also in a minute a few real experiment recordings. So the dog is allowed to do what he wants. I mean, this Belgian Shepherd likes to play with the ball. Then at some point, the dog owner will also play with the dog and trying to interact. This is important for us to see how they normally interact in this situation. So, and then can we move forward by 2 minutes approximately? More or less, doesn't matter because, yeah, so now we have the stranger coming into the room, and you can see that the stranger has a specific task. First of all, she has to stay here for a few seconds, that we can see whether the dog is approaching the stranger or not, or how intensive this approach, or if you like, greeting is. Then we can also observe whether how the dog interacts with the stranger afterwards. This Belgian Shepherd is very much into strangers. I mean, he just likes to be petted by anybody in the world. He's probably having this Guinness record to be touched by all people that exist. Anyway, so they are, and this is what you can now observe, and also the people have a nice interaction. They just talk to each other and enjoy. Now the stranger gets the next task to play with the dog for a short time. What you can also now see, it's not surprising that this dog will play with the stranger in a similar or a quite intensive way. Next jump. Okay, now you can see that the owner has left and the behavior of the dog also has changed, which is, I mean, in this case, that's what we see. The dogs, they might react differently. So now the stranger is still there, so there's a human there. Dog is not alone. Already you can see marked changes. The dog is in front of the door. That's what we would describe as separation behaviors, basically behaviors specifically shown during the separation from the owner. Although we have actually, you can see on the chair, the leash of the dog, which is usually, we ask the owners to leave an object there, but in some dogs, this might be an effective way to decrease the separation behavior. In other dogs that might not work. Now you can also see that if this case, the stranger tries to tries to play with the dog, although it's the same dog, and the only difference is that you don't have the owner here, that is now a different dog. So basically the dog is more still concentrating on the door where the owner left and is not really interested in playing with the stranger too much, although it's really a dog that likes to play with anybody in most situations. Can we go ahead and again? Yes, now the owner comes back and dog is happy as before. You can see again, I mean, we look at the differences in greeting behavior toward the owner, toward the stranger. That's why the behavior of the stranger and the owner is sort of organized in a similar way as much as we can do that. Yes, again, a little bit playing, and then, of course, the worst thing comes. The dog doesn't know that, but I know already that the dog will be left alone. So we can jump again a little bit forward, maybe more. Yes, so that's the sort of the worst time of this test, where the dog is now alone in the room. No people are helping him in a social way or supporting him socially. He's waiting, and actually with this dog, this will go on for a long time. So we just jump ahead and look what happens when the stranger comes back. And you can see that when the stranger comes back, I mean, the dogs are not really enthusiastic about it. That you can see that for this dog, actually they're really waiting for that particular person. That's what I'm saying at the beginning. It's an individual-specific behavior, what you can see as an attachment. And again, the stranger tries to support the behavior emotionally, the dog emotionally, but that doesn't seem to work. So again, and we can just jump to the end that you'll be assured that the owner comes back. So the whole story ends with a happy end, actually, that the dog and the owner is united and everyone can sleep well and happily. Now, the next step is, of course, for the researchers to work on that data. Here, can we just play both videos together, because we can also save time like that? These are now real recordings from experiments. It's a different room from some older times when our lab was much smaller than today. And you can just see, again, two Belgian Shepherds, in this case, in a similar experiment, behaving quite differently, so towards the stranger. So you can see that this dog is really showing signs of fear, avoidance, and in the minute when the stranger came in, this approached the owner. So that is what you could assume as a sort of secure or safe haven thing. I mean, it's difficult to evaluate at that level when their dog is perceiving some sort of danger, and then it looks for the owner as a reassuring basis. And again, I mean, you can see, as you might have expected, that this dog will not actively play with the stranger. Actually, this dog might be a little bit more playful with the stranger, but again, you don't see that behavior that was so obvious with the former dog that was actually also a Belgian Shepherd. So just to have not having the breed differences at that level involved. Okay, so basically, after looking at many dogs, we actually came to this conclusion that maybe this whole behavior, what was described as attachment behavior in general, or it's actually often labeled as attachment behavior, which I'm not really very happy with, is that you have three factors. And these three factors actually are explaining most of the behavior variability that you see. And of course, each factors have different values, so to speak, for each dog. I will come to that back later. So the three factors, one is the tendency to explore, or you can do it a little bit reverse, the tendency to show fear in a novel environment. The second factor is what I call an affinity to the stranger or to an unfamiliar person, or actually you can also call it fear of strangers, basically depending on what sort of aspect you like. And the third is the affinity to the owner, or you could call it attachment to the owner. It's basically the tendency of the dog to be together, to look for the proximity of the owner for whatever reason. And after many, let's say, statistical work on this data, we have decided that maybe it's either, so it's easiest to understand what's going on if you give different scores for dogs as having low, intermediate, of high or high values on these three factors of behavior. So basically, we come up with this idea that having these three factors, you can show it quite nicely in a three-dimensional space. Each dog has actually one value. One is represented by one dot, in this case a star. And you can look at, for example, that this star reflects a dog that it has a high affinity to stranger, a relatively low affinity to the owner, and also relatively low affinity or low tendency to explore. So basically, a fearful behavior in that particular environment. And looking at that and testing large number of dogs, actually found that there are specific groups of dogs. So for example, you can find dogs that have low scores, so they are not really keen on exploring a novel environment. They have intermediate affinity to a stranger and a low affinity to the owner, and you have other groups, and we found these as a reliable pattern. So actually, if you look at many dogs, you can see, I mean, this is a picture where you have, here are the individual dogs at the bottom, so these little signals are for each is for one dog, and here's a group of dogs that behavior is very much similar, and there's another group of dogs that behave very similarly, and so on. And we identify these 5 categories, which I think is very important in order to understand how these attachment patterns actually work. So, however, this early work was criticized by people that saying that, okay, you can show this general pattern, which is similar to human behavior pattern, but we haven't found, or at least we haven't discussed, one of the other basic ideas is this secure base effect. So that really the presence of the owner in this case really helps in many situations, especially if there's some sort of danger. And it helps the dog to recover and or decrease, in that case, its stress behavior. So Marta Galci, who was very much interested in that sort of topic, she really designed a quite complicated experiment. I can't go into much detail of this because it's much more complicated than I can show it to you. But the idea is that we wanted to put together a situation where the dog really experiences a specific threat and where the owner's presence might really make a difference. So what she did actually is a shorter version of this complicated test. We had just an episode where the dog was basically with or without the owner in a relaxed situation, and then a threatening stranger entered the room and tried really to threaten the dog in a very specific way for a short time. And then we observed the dog during this threatening situation and also after the threatening situation. And what we actually measured is here not so much the behavior, we looked also at the vocal behavior of the dog, so how they react to this approaching stranger, but we also looked at the heart measure in a non-invasive way to find out about how the level of how the stress level of the dog was modulated by the presence of the owner. So here is just a video about this experiment. So here's now this part where the stranger is coming. So here you can see parts of the owner and the whole dog watching the stranger. The stranger is really trying to threaten the dog in a very specific way. We did it in order to collect good data that could be comparable between different dogs in various situations. And yeah, sorry, the video sometimes crashes between, but it then will become better. I think after a few minutes you have to be patient. I don't know, it's an old video and we didn't manage to copy it. Yeah, so that's how the stranger, you can barely see that the stranger moving. The stranger tries to have an eye contact with the dog, and when the dog looks to the side, then the stranger waits until the dog looks back, and then she continues to approach. And we did this approach for a duration where we thought that the data are enough for measuring the heart rate. And actually, if you look at the dog, you can see that the dog really, although it's in a fixed place, they try to interact with the owner and showing behaviors that might indicate also this, secure base effect thing. But that could be very difficult to evaluate. So this is why we concentrated much more on the heart rate. So, and we put the dogs in 2 groups because not all dogs are reacting in the same way to the threatening stranger, even if we make the situation very much the same. So one type of dog, what we call behaviorally non-reactive dogs, that seem to be dogs that were not very much affected by this approach. They just don't seem to be concerned about what's going on. I mean, it's like with people, with other things. I mean, what stimulus, and these stimulus are not very dramatic, so some dogs might be sensitive to them, some not. So that's usually the problem if you don't using very harsh stimuli, that you don't really know how your experimental animals react to them. So that's, I think, a fair way of portraying the data to have those animals in a separate group that were reacting to those stimulus and others that didn't. So the non-reactive animals, so basically reactive, I call that you have heard some growling or barking when they were threatened. So the non-reactive animals, you can see that the light gray bars, they don't seem to, sorry, that's the heart rate. So the heart rate, and you would assume that heart rates go up with larger stress feeling. So if you look at this, then you can see that heart rate in the non-reactive one, dogs don't really change. It's whatever happens. When the owner is present, when the owner is absent, whether before, during, or after the threatening. The only difference what emerged was that the dogs that were actually reactive, first of all, when they were threatened, then their heart rate went up, which is what we would expect it in both cases. So that is sort of fine from the theoretical point of view, at least. And then what you can also see is that if the owner were present, however, this increase, if you like, is much smaller, significantly smaller than in compared to the situation when the owner was not present. So that 10 beats per second is probably the difference that an owner can make when she's there in the case of danger compared to the situation when she's absent. And I think this is one type of data that you might use for convincing people who don't believe that there is this attachment relationship between human and dog, and that the dog attachment behavior fulfills all the criteria that were put forward for human attachment, that really dogs can use people as a secure base. But of course, I'm sure that you all knew that in many private experiences with your dog, but you know, for scientists, sometimes some trivial things must be really underpinned with data unless you don't get through. So, and Marta actually did other studies, which I don't really want to go into detail about how how rapidly actually you can develop an attachment-like relationship in dogs. And she studied dogs in a shelter, and it turned out, and if you have later time to read this paper, you can also be convinced, I hope, that it turned out that a very short contact, I mean about less than an hour, just being together, walking together, so without any food, without anything of others, dogs can already start developing an attachment-like behavior toward that particular person. And I think that has, again, practical implications. I mean, the question is, of course, you're having these dogs in a shelter. Now, people are coming and, you know, looking for a dog. Sometimes there's an advice, okay, just try to interact with the dog in a shelter, because, of course, it's understandable that if you want to take a dog at home, it's good to have some sort of interaction, which I understand from the human point of view, but from a dog point of view, they don't know that these are now just sort of a, you know, a beauty show or whatever. So they always hope that this will be my guy or my owner. So they start to hope, if you like, and you can use Mark's word here. So anyway, it's again an interesting aspect that you know that if you are interacting with a shelter dog that lives in the shelter and probably looks for an owner, or at least expects a person, they always think about you as a potential person to be attached to. And then, of course, if they are not chosen, probably they also get into sort of a separation behavior, which is the result if this attachment is distracted by any way or any means. Okay. Last story regarding to attachment is basically this wolf-dog comparison. I really have to do it very fast because, again, I don't really have so much time to do it. But basically, the story shows for us, from our perspective, is that if you raise a wolf, just like a dog, actually, our wolves, as I told you a little bit yesterday, were really socialized quite in an intensive way. Still, you find differences in attachment behavior, so towards humans with the same test. And this is what's shown in this figure, basically having dogs and wolves compared. These are young, about 4 months old animals, and you can see, and unfortunately can't go into detail on this, you can really see that there is a species-specific effect, and because both species were experiencing the very same social environment, we really see or really think that there is some genetic change which is responsible for that difference between dogs and wolves. Actually, why attachment might be interesting is also to look at those factors that might influence this behavior. So actually, with the help of some programmers, we asked them to based on our sort of three main factors, that they design a program where attachment can be visualized and automatized, if you like. And this little program, actually, what you can see now here is just reiterating what I told you by everything is virtual now. So basically, here's the owner, and the owner can play with this little dog here, and you did it, and you know, you can. This is the ball, symbolizing the ball, so that you can see this nice play. And then this is the stranger coming in and influencing the behavior of the dog. And the colors of the dog might actually also indicate a little bit of the tail wagging that the dog noticed that the stranger is there. Now he can also play with the stranger if the stranger plays with the dog, but you can also see that when the owner will go out, then this behavior of the dog will change. And the interesting thing in this program is that actually this is based on relatively simple rules that were established in our investigations, looking at the dog-human attachment in that case. So, and it's very nice to see that what you observe in a behavior and what you sort of distill into rules of behavior, you can also then use for building something. And that is, again, a feedback that shows that our ideas at the beginning were probably true. Okay, I skipped that to be more practical. Going to the other side. So the second topic, which I, again, unfortunately do not much time to talk about, is concerning imitation. And here, a little story I have to share with you is that I must confess that I never believed in imitation in dogs. The whole idea came, again, from my professor. He always told us week by week, I mean, you know, my dog is imitating me here and there and so on, so you guys, you have to show that. I mean, you have to come up with some sort of experiment arrangement and prove that dogs can imitate. And we are sort of, I'm quite a conservative one, especially don't want to go into huge scientific debates where already there's a lot of tension about whether rats, dogs, monkeys, whoever can imitate or cannot imitate, specifically because imitation is very difficult to define. So what you understand if imitation and so on. So anyway, at some point we decided, I mean, that's too much. I mean, we should really do something about his ideas. So together with my colleague, Josef Topal, we worked together with this Belgian shepherd named Philip. And where Philip was very famous for is that he was the first dog for the disabled, trained and then given to the owner, Richard, in Hungary. And we saw that, okay, I mean, dogs might imitate or might not imitate, but I mean, we probably need a clever dog to do that, if they and do it at all. So we saw that if Philip can do it, then there's a chance, you know, that if there's imitation dogs, that Philip might just be the right choice. So we designed an experiment based on some experiments that were run much earlier on chimpanzees, which is basically an experiment where I just saw, yes, which, yeah, we can skip this actually. Basically, it's called a do as I do experiment. So the idea is that you have a demonstrator and a learner and or an observer. And then the demonstrator, in this case it's a human, shows an action. And then there is, after the action, there's a signal, a command, if you like. And then the observer has to repeat the command. So the idea is that we try to get Philip to understand this rule. And in order to do that, I mean, you need a set of actions. So these were the actions that we actually used: body turning, jumping, bowling, lying down, and so on. And this is the actions that the demonstrator was shown. And then the task of the dog was to repeat this action after the command. And as you can see, this is the setup of the training session, a very crude way. So the human, the dog, and there are many things around. I mean, chairs with sticks on them, a plastic box, bottles on the floor, and so on. So, and there are actions that actually you don't need anything to do with, because it's like lying down. You don't need to touch any objects. So the chance for doing many things that was there, the dog could choose what to do. But in this background, it was really interesting whether the dog actually did what it has seen. Now, at that level, again, it's basically simple, I mean, you might say simple learning, because the dog has just to learn, and he gets rewarded for that. Actually, reward in the case of Philip was a little bit play with the ball afterwards. So he gets rewarded if he's choosing the correct action. Now, you can imagine that if I jump in air, then jumping in air on a human looks quite different, or is a different type of action than jumping in air from a dog. So basically, at that level, we can't really look at exact matching. What we're looking is at some sort of correspondence, and what the dog has to learn is this sort of rule that, okay, the person shows something, then I hear the signal, and then I can do what I like to do, or at least try to match the behavior to some extent. So after this training, which took, in the case of Philip, 10 weeks and many presentations and so on, we finally did some experiments, so in that case testing, where now we really wanted to see whether Philip can do, or the question was what he's doing when he is shown new actions. Now, because of the time is going so fast, I can't show you the whole new sets of behavior, so actually I just showed you a short film on what was prepared for demonstrating this experiment. So at the beginning, what you see is some trained actions. So you can see Josep lying down, standing up, Philip is watching, and then he tells the command. You can't hear it, but you can see from his mouth movements, and Philip is imitating, or at least executing a behavior that corresponds to his actions. Then hopefully and he gets up, and then he gets, in this case, food. Then the next action is again some different thing. An object will given to Richard, the owner here, and Philip can do the same based on what he can see, he observes. Probably there's another one, yes. So again, I mean, this is the same setup, but now the action is different. So Philip has to figure out, which way you have to execute this action. And then this is the bowing on the part of the human, and of course of the dog. Again, I mean, how the dog is doing it, it's different, because this is what we sort of told the dog that this is what you should do in this situation. That's actually barking, which is again was a part of the training, but a different modality, if you like. Turning around, again, a trivial behavior, but again, if you look at the shape of the behavior, it's also different. Now, the one thing what we will demonstrate here, this is a new action. So that dog observes for the first time putting a videotape on a chair, and this was executed now by Richard, the owner, and Philip also imitated that in a new situation. Yeah, I think that was it. Oops, where are we now? Yeah, here. Okay, so the basic idea here was that actually it seems to be, and people can read the paper if they like, is that this works quite well with dogs. So very luckily, I always believed that, that's a very nice method to train a dog, because you are also involved in this sort of training. It's not about that you are standing there and they say, oh, this and this and this and that, but actually you are part of the whole interaction, so it's very much a social thing. And also that sort of approach allows you for the dog actually to generalize much easily than using the classical way of training. So, but I was telling this to many people. I went everywhere and nobody seemed to be interested in, until I went to Italy, where Claudia Fugazza came to me and said, well, I want to use this method for my dogs, training my dogs. And said, well, I mean, okay, if you want, then that's fine. And the problem was, I mean, for me personally, that actually she took it seriously. So she came back to a few years later, and now, okay, I don't want to do only do the training, but actually I also want to have a PhD with you together to find out how this is really working and what are the advantages and the constraints of this method. So one of these collaboration is that you can also find now a video actually outside and buy it about the training method that she then applied and make it formal for dog trainers. But also we were looking together really at some other aspects of this. And for example, what she did was comparing dogs that are certified for clicker training. So basically they have a certification that they are professional clicker trained dogs, whatever it means really. And she also came up with an idea of a do as I do certification. So basically a certification for dogs that can learn by imitation. Again, something which is very specific one. So we have these two types of dogs, and then we subjected these dogs to similar tasks. I mean, she did it, so I just sort of helped her a little bit from far away. And the idea is then you have simple tasks, so like ringing a bell, or you have a complex task, which means the action, actually to execute the action is more complicated from a dog's point of view. And you can also have a little action sequence, putting objects into a basket or manipulating one object in relation to the other. And what you can see here is in a very short time is that if you have simple actions, then, that's a latency for performance. So how fast a dog, either trained by imitation or by shaping, so that sort of clicker training method, is able to carry out, and owners at any time were allowed to quit. So if they don't want to press the dog more, then they just could give up. So we measured, and there were no problems. So within 1 minute, both groups performed with simple actions. There's emerged difference already with complex action, which is also there in the sequence. So in the last two situations, it seems to be that dogs that are trained with imitation, and now I have to be very careful. Imitation, although there's a statistical significance here, I would say, or we would suggest that they are at least as good as, okay? So dogs trained with other methods. Because I don't really want, so it's not like we don't want to win this competitive idea that which method is better. You will see for your own, if you try it out, which method is good for this, because this is a specific situation anyway, but we think that there are advantages using the imitation as a training method for your dogs, especially if you train dogs who have to carry out complicated actions, like dogs who are working for disabled and so on, so they have to manipulate complex things which actually are not really a natural part of the dog's behavior. And just to, oops, now I have to go back. Can we go back? And then you just to see one demo video from Claudia's work to see how this is organized. So now I can hopefully convince you that it's not just Philip that can imitate. Actually, there is an idea that maybe all dogs can imitate. Unfortunately, they sort of forget to imitate when they are sort of living together with humans, and we can talk about this maybe later if you are interested in this. So this is the general way how it's tested. So there is some action that the owner has shown in this case, then there's a waiting period. Sometimes we can also do things during this waiting period, and the dog, as you can see, still remembers actually the action, what has been demonstrated before. So this is a typical distraction that we want the dog to forget, or at least to make the task difficult for the dog. And you can see that it's just working very nicely in this case. We can also use a different person, so it's not really the person. So we also did this, what we call a clever hands control, that the person, in this case Claudia, she doesn't know what was shown before to the dog. She just gives the command, and the dog is still performing nicely. I skipped this one because we don't have time for this. So I think what we really have learned here is that if you have this idea of social competence, then you can come up with interesting hypotheses about functions of the behavior, which might be important. And I hope to showing you two examples of imitation-like or social learning in more general and attachment. Both seem to be very important and efficient on the part of the dog, and actually may be contributing to their success in the human community, in a human social, human families, and so on. So, and as I say, whether these are working in a similar way, I could also say probably not. So for many reasons, actually, because also the experience is different. In the case of the imitation, you can find out also, if you are trying to go along these lines, that there are limitations because, for example, dogs don't have that sort of freedom of movement what humans usually have, and so on. But despite of that, I think there are very important shared mechanisms between dogs and humans, and I've seen, actually, if everything would be the same, then doing science in dogs would be quite boring. And with that thought, I would like to thank for your attention and for listening. Thank you very much.